Welcome to Life Stories, where real experiences shape extraordinary journeys. Today, we bring you the incredible story of Ava, a girl who was cast aside by her own family, only to rise above the betrayal and build a life of success on her own terms. From heartbreak to triumph. From being treated as invisible to becoming the owner of a thriving business. Her journey is one of resilience, courage, and self-worth. How did she turn pain into power? Let's begin her story. Subscribe to Life Stories to start today's journey. I never thought I'd be telling this story. But here I am. 30 years old and finally ready to say it out loud. My name is Ava. And this is how my life changed forever when I was 13. Back then, we were what most would call a normal family. It was just my mom, my dad, and me, living in our cozy little house on Oak Ridge Lane. It wasn't grand, but it was ours, a 2-bedroom home with an old oak tree in the front yard, where I used to sit and read for hours. My dad, Mark, was a construction worker, strong and kind, the type of man who always smelled like sawdust and coffee. My mom, Linda, worked part-time as a bookkeeper and spent most of her time making sure our home was warm and welcoming. We weren't rich, but we were happy. At least, that's what I thought. Then everything fell apart. It was a Tuesday morning. Just like any other. Dad kissed me on the forehead before heading to work. His usual promise hanging in the air. Be good, kiddo. I'll see you tonight. But he never came home. A freak accident on site. A misstep. A fall, just like that. He was gone. I don't remember much about the funeral. Only the sound of my mom crying deep, broken sobs that rattled her whole body. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. It felt impossible that someone so full of life could just disappear. And then, as if losing Dad wasn't enough, I lost my mother too, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. She stopped being the woman who kissed me goodnight and helped me with my homework. Instead, she became a shadow, a ghost moving through the house, staring at the walls as if waiting for him to walk through the door. I tried everything to bring her back, making her tea, telling her stories, hugging her the way Dad used to hug us. Nothing worked. Then, one evening, about 6 months later, she sat me down at the kitchen table. She was fidgeting with her coffee cup, a nervous habit I'd never seen before. Ava, honey, she said, her voice softer than usual. I need to tell you something important. I looked up from my plate. Waiting. I've met someone. His name is Greg, and he makes me happy again. The words felt like ice water down my spine. I should have seen it coming. The late-night phone calls. The sudden interest in her appearance. The unexplained errands. But I had been too wrapped up in my own grief to notice. Then she said the words that really broke me. His moving in with us, and his bringing his daughter, Lily. I stared at her, my heart pounding. But, Mom, it's only been 6 months since Dad. Her expression hardened. Life goes on. Ava. Greg is a good man. And Lily needs a mother figure. We can be a family again. A family. That's what she called it when Greg moved in 2 weeks later, bringing boxes of his things and his wide-eyed 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily was everything my mother had always wanted in a daughter. Tiny, with blonde pigtails and big blue eyes. The kind of child you see on Christmas commercials. Full of innocence and giggles. Mom doted on her from the start. Look at her, Ava, she would say, watching Lily color at the kitchen table. Isn't she precious? She needs so much love and attention at this age. Love and attention. 2 things I had once had but no longer did. I watched as my mother transformed herself into the perfect stepmother, while I became invisible. The moment I truly understood my place in this new family came a week after Greg and Lily moved in. Greg's mother, Mrs. Whitman, came to visit, a sharp-eyed woman with pursed lips who looked at me like I was an unwanted guest in my own home. Oh, what a big girl you are, she said. reaching out to pinch my cheek so hard I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. Such a pretty face. Her fingers dug into my skin like claws. Then she turned to Greg. You know, this house would be perfect if she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The way she looked at me said it all. That night, when I checked the mirror, I found bruises where she had pinched me. When I showed my mother, she simply shook her head. Don't be dramatic, Ava. Life settled into a routine. Mom, Greg, and Lily became a perfect little unit, going to the park, having movie nights, laughing together at the dinner table. Meanwhile, I was sent away more and more often. Ava, honey, Mom would say, avoiding my gaze. Janet needs help with little Ellie today. You don't mind, do you? So off I went to Janet's house, where at least someone seemed happy to see me. Ellie was 4, full of energy, with bouncy curls and a gap-toothed smile that could melt anyone's heart. She would run up to me, shouting, Ava, Ava, before pulling me into her little games. Janet, her mother, was kind too. She would ask about school, about my day, about me. For a few hours, I felt seen. I felt like I belonged. But back at home, it was different. Mrs. Whitman was always there, criticizing the house, my manners, my posture. And Greg, he was just as bad, though in a different way. If I knocked over a glass or dropped a plate, he would explode. Do you know how much that cost? He would shout. Of course. You don't. You've never earned $1 in your life. Just a freeloader. Living off my hard work. Each time, I looked to Mom, hoping for just one word of defense. Just once. But she never did. Instead, she would busy herself with Lily, pretending she didn't hear. I had never felt so alone. And yet, I knew deep down this wasn't just loneliness. This was the beginning of something much worse. By the time I turned 16, I had given up on the idea of ever feeling at home again. The house on Oak Ridge Lane might have still had my bed, my books, and my name on a chore list stuck to the fridge. But it wasn't my home anymore. It was theirs. I was just an unwanted guest. Mom, Greg, and Lily had their routines, weekend outings, movie nights, Sunday brunches at a diner across town. I was never invited. Instead, I was given excuses. Oh, Ava, we thought you had homework, Mom would say when they returned, laughter still in their voices. Or worse, you wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway, Greg would add, smirking. At dinner, they'd talk about things I wasn't a part of, Lily's ballet recital, their plans for the holidays. If I spoke, Greg would barely acknowledge me. Mrs. Whitman had practically moved in by then. Always critiquing, always hovering. She's still slouching, she would mutter, pinching my arm this time instead of my cheek. No wonder she looks so awkward. But the worst part wasn't the coldness. It was the silence. Mom was no longer the woman who used to brush my hair at night, whispering stories in the dim light of my bedroom. Now, she barely looked at me. She had decided long ago which daughter she wanted to keep. And it wasn't me. I realized then that if I was going to survive, I had to stop relying on them. I needed to make my own way. That summer, I started working. I didn't ask permission. I didn't tell anyone. I just did it. I made flyers advertising dog walking services and taped them to street lamps and mailboxes. I knocked on doors, introduced myself, and offered to babysit. I even helped Mr. Carter, the elderly man down the block, carry his groceries in exchange for a couple of dollars. Within a month, I had regular clients. Mrs. Peterson, a woman 2 streets over, hired me to walk her golden retriever, Maximum every afternoon. The Martinez twins, mischievous 6-year-olds with boundless energy, needed weekend babysitting. And Janet, sweet, kind Janet, offered to pay me for watching Ellie after school. I said yes to everything. For the first time, I had my own money. I didn't waste it on candy or movies like other kids my age. I saved every dollar, stuffing the bills into an old showbox under my bed. 3 months later, I had enough for what I had been dreaming of, my own phone. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic smartphone that was on sale. But it was mine. I brought it home that day, unable to hide my smile. I finally had something that no one could take away from me. Or so I thought. That evening, as I was setting up my phone in my room, Lily barged in without knocking, something she always did. "What's that?" she demanded, her blue eyes widening as she pointed at the phone in my hands. "My new phone," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I bought it myself." Her mouth fell open. "I want one too." Before I could stop her, she spun on her heel and ran downstairs, her voice shrill as she screamed, "Daddy, Ava has a phone, and I want one." I barely had time to brace myself before I heard Greg's heavy footsteps stomping up the stairs. "What's this about a phone?" he barked, stepping into my room without knocking. I stood up, gripping the device tightly. "I bought it. With my own money. From my jobs." Greg's face twisted into something between amusement and anger. Without a word, he reached out, snatched the phone from my hands, and turned to Lily. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said, handing it to her like a prize. "Daddy's got you covered." Lily beamed. I, on the other hand, felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, to fight, to grab it back. But I knew it wouldn't matter. No one in this house would take my side. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. The next morning at school, I walked into my English class and found my teacher, Mrs. Collins. She had always been kind to me, always paid attention when I spoke. I sat down across from her and, in a shaking voice, told her everything. About the phone, about Greg's constant belittling, about my mother's indifference. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Then she stood up and said, "Come with me." I followed her to the principal's office. By the end of the day, my mother had been called in. I wasn't allowed in the meeting, but I heard the raised voices from outside. Mom's tone, sharp with anger. The principal, firm and serious. When Mom finally came out, her face was red, her hands clenched into fists. She shoved my phone into my hands without looking at me. "Here," she snapped. "I hope you're happy now." That night, after Lily had cried for hours about losing her phone, Mom stormed into my room. "How dare you," she hissed. "How dare you go behind our backs like that? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" I swallowed hard, gripping my phone tight. "You're nothing but a traitor," she spat. And then she turned and left, slamming the door behind her. For the next 2 weeks, she and Greg ignored me completely. At dinner, they passed dishes around me like I wasn't there. If I spoke, no one responded. If I entered a room, they left. I had never felt so alone in my life. But I had my phone. I had my jobs. And I had a plan. I wasn't going to be Greg's freeloader anymore. I was going to find a way out. The silent treatment lasted for weeks. At first, I thought it would pass. That eventually, Mom would get tired of pretending I didn't exist. That Greg would find a new way to belittle me instead of just acting like I was invisible. But they were committed. At dinner, Greg would pass dishes to Lily and Mom, skipping right over me. If I reached for something, no one acknowledged it. When I spoke, no one answered. It was as if I had vanished from their world. In a way, I think they wanted me to break. They wanted me to beg for forgiveness, to apologize for daring to stand up for myself. But I didn't. Instead, I did the opposite. I worked harder. I picked up extra dog walking clients. I babysat more often. I even started tutoring kids from school in math, charging $10 an hour. Every spare moment I had, I was earning. I stuffed every dollar into my showbox under the bed. I wasn't just saving for another phone or some small luxury. I was saving for my escape. By the time I turned 17, I had built a life outside of my house. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I spent most of my free time at Janet's house with Ellie, or at Mr. Carter's helping him with groceries. And then, one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. I had just finished walking Maximum, Mrs. Peterson's golden retriever. When I checked the mailbox on my way inside, there was a letter addressed to me. A thick envelope with the words State College Admissions Office printed in bold letters at the top. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Dear Miss Carter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been awarded a full scholarship to State College. I read it 3 times before it sank in. A full scholarship. I had done it. I was going to college. And I wouldn't have to beg Greg for a single dime. That night, I waited for the right moment. I sat at the dinner table, watching them chat about their weekend plans, the upcoming trip to visit Greg's family, Lily's latest ballet class. I took a deep breath and said, I have some good news. They all stopped and turned to look at me, as if surprised I had spoken. I got accepted to State College, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, on a full scholarship. For a moment, there was silence. Then Greg dropped his fork onto his plate with a loud clatter. You applied to college without telling me, he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I blinked. Why would I need to tell you? He let out a harsh laugh. You live in my house, eat my food, and you think you can make decisions like this without running it by me first? It's a full scholarship, I said, my stomach tightening. You wouldn't have to pay anything. Damn right I wouldn't, he snapped. Not a single cent for an ungrateful freeloader like you. Always sneaking around. Always plotting something. I turned to Mom. My last hope. Mom, I pleaded. Please. I worked so hard for this. She finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time in weeks. But there was no warmth in her gaze. Why should I? She said coldly. You've never shown any respect for this family. You've never accepted Greg. All you've done is try to destroy my marriage from day one. Something inside me snapped. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. Respect him? He's a bully. He treats me like garbage. And you let him. The slap came out of nowhere. A sharp, stinging pain across my cheek. For a moment, I couldn't even process it. I looked up, my vision blurring, and saw my mother standing there, her hand still raised. Get out, she whispered. Then, louder. Get out of my house. The room spun around me. I touched my cheek where she had hit me, half expecting to wake up from this nightmare. But it was real. I turned and ran. Upstairs. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with whatever I could, my phone, my school documents, the little bit of cash I had saved. Everything else would have to stay. Downstairs, I could hear Greg muttering something. Lily giggling. Mom still breathing heavily from her outburst. I didn't look back. 10 minutes later, I was standing on Madison's front porch, my hands shaking as I knocked on the door. When she opened it and saw my face, saw the redness of my cheek, the backpack slung over my shoulder, she didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me inside and hugged me. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Standing in my own restaurant, watching my mother's face turn pale as she realized the truth. I felt something shift inside me. I had spent years believing that one day, she would see me, that she would regret throwing me away. But as I looked at her now, humiliated, lost, I understood something profound. I didn't need her validation. I didn't need their approval. I had built a life for myself. A successful, independent life that had nothing to do with them. As security escorted them out, I turned to Jenny, who was smiling knowingly. Ready to check on table 5, she asked. I straightened my blazer, wiped my hands, and nodded. Let's do it. Because my story wasn't about revenge. It was about rising above. about proving to myself that I was always worth more. Subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible real-life journeys.